Hello, and welcome back to the Big Sky Business Insights Summit. I'm Grant Keir, President and CEO of the Missoula Economic Partnership. Thank you for those of you who are joining us now. I hope you had a chance to attend our last panel discussion. It was just a really extraordinary view of sort of what's possible through innovation in Montana, everything from telemedicine to better connecting providers, and hopefully in the future, scientists across the state. To really understanding what the opportunities are for improving and increasing our ability to produce tests right here in our home state of Montana. I am delighted to welcome back today Sean Becker, VP of Shared Services and Ventures for the Montana Hospital Association, and our guests, Dr. Eric Donaldson, virologist and regulatory scientist with the Food and Drug Administration, for a fireside chat to take some of the ideas that we just explored in that conversation and take a look at what they might mean in terms of the coming months, years ahead of us in terms of this individual pandemic, but also the potential for future pandemics down the road. So Sean and Eric, please, if you could join me now on camera.
Hello.
Thank you so much. And for this, I know I've been off screen for some of these panel discussions. I'm going to stick around and join Sean and Dr. Donaldson to just bring in some of the thoughts and ideas that have percolated throughout the entire 3-day session. And thank you both for letting me join you.
Thanks, Grant. I think that maybe we could give some people some perspective, Eric, of kind of your experience and background. Before we dive back in, Eric and I were actually friends at Montana State University in Bozeman when he was completing his BS in microbiology back in the late 90s, early aughts. And when we started talking about like what in Montana, what's our role? What have we been in the biosciences and health sciences? How have we contributed globally in industry? And then, really, what's the future look like for us? I thought immediately of you, Eric, as being someone who's in the trenches on virology, as a virologist for the FDA, as well as a futurist of having authored 2 books on sort of the post-apocalyptical world after pandemics. And at some point in this conversation, we're going to come back to that. So maybe, Eric, if you could just do a brief introduction.
Yeah, I'd love to. So it's great to join you at the summit. I feel like I'm back in Montana, even though I'm teleporting from Maryland. So I was born in Montana and spent most of my life in Montana until my education took me to North Carolina for graduate school. I had a small business building log and willow furniture for 8 years in Kalispell, and I hurt my back delivering a slate tabletop, and ended up in bed for 2 weeks. And during that time, I read the book The Hot Zone, which is a book about the Ebola virus and its discovery and its outbreaks and all things terrifying about Ebola. And it really inspired me to find out more about viruses. So I went to the library and checked out some books that were over my head, and ended up going to the Flathead Valley Community College. I was about 30 years old. Took some classes there, ended up getting an associate's degree, and then transferring to Montana State University, where I met Sean, and actually Blake as well. Blake was a grad student when I was working in the research lab there as a technician. And so it feels like, like the governor was talking about, the one town with a long Main Street that extends all the way to Maryland after this conference. And so my training took me to North Carolina, where I studied. I was interested in Ebola, but Ebola is it's a very specialized field where you have to be BSL 4, biosafety level 4 trained, and there are not a lot of facilities for that. So I ended up in North Carolina studying coronavirus in Ralph Barrick's lab. And from there, ended up at the Food and Drug Administration, where I work in the Division of Antiviral Products. And so I've been working on projects related to both coronavirus and Ebola virus. And so it's been an interesting time. I've never been at home more than I have been for the last 9 months or 10 months, and I'm certainly never worked more hours than I have. And so it's definitely an interesting time.
And thank you for making time for us today. This is going to be a valuable session, I think, for all of us, and hopefully it is for you too. One of the things that we want to start off with is what do you think in the next 3 to 5 years things are going to be for us? I mean, we're in the middle of this pandemic. How does it wrap down? And we know we still have strains of the 2018 Spanish flu that are known as the common cold today. And that in 2010, you actually authored a paper predicting that we would have a pandemic with the coronavirus. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, so the fact that I predicted a pandemic or not, the next spillover is actually the wording I think I used in that paper. Doesn't make me able to see the future. It just makes me a coronavirologist, because if you looked at all of the papers in that time and since then, since SARS emerged, we were all saying that, it's only a matter of time and ecological opportunity, because these viruses, with the case of SARS, it came through a wet market where likely a bat infected civets and raccoon dogs, and they became the intermediate host that transferred the virus to humans, and from there it spread around the world. Characterized by super spreader events by one doctor in Hong Kong who ended up infecting, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 additional cases, who then traveled all around the world. And I think when we think about pandemics and where they're coming from, and in our modern time, it's just, we're at a place with world population where it's continuing to grow. Populations are encroaching into natural areas at a greater rate than ever before. And we also, in the backdrop of, have travel opportunities that would allow somebody to travel from one of these places all the way across the world to a major metropolitan area within 24 hours. So the opportunities for the next pandemic and this pandemic and SARS, it has been bore out by those facts, I believe. And you're asking about, I think, kind of in the context of what does this mean for future? Still as a coronavirologist, I would say, if I'm writing a paper, let's say we have a vaccine and things return to normal a little bit in a couple of years, we get to the point where it's normalizing. I would still say the next coronavirus pandemic is just a matter of time and ecological opportunity. And that's because the things that are happening that spurned this one and the previous ones are probably still happening in those areas. And I'm not sure how you would stop, because that's human behavior, I don't know how you would stop the human behavior from encroaching or from, urbanization. But there are things that I think that we can do and have tried to do in some cases to sort of predict which viruses might emerge and to have systems in place to monitor for those.
How many coronaviruses are there?
Oh, there are many. So one of my favorite research studies was looking for coronaviruses in bats in Western Maryland. And so it was the only time in my career that I've ever been out in the field with a harp tent, it basically is a giant harp you put in front of a tunnel. And when the bats come out, they hit the wires, they can't detect those. And so they hit it's basically fishing line, separated about the distance of an inch or so. They hit that and drop down into a plastic pouch. And then you can reach down there with a gloved hand and grab them and put them in a bag and collect samples. And we were looking at a hibernacula in Western Maryland in an abandoned railroad tunnel that had several different bat species living together. And so I was very interested in, first of all, are there coronaviruses, the different bat species? And number two, are they trafficking between those species? Is there some opportunity there for recombination and evolution that might predict, how coronaviruses move between different animal species? And these are actually the same species. And so what I found in that, is that there, I looked at, I think, 7 or 8 different species, and I found sequence information of a coronavirus in every one of those sequences, in every one of those species that was different. So I left that study with the impression that probably just about every bat has their own coronavirus. And that's just the bat coronaviruses. Then you have bird coronaviruses, and you have the beluga whale coronavirus, and you have snake coronaviruses, and the pangolin coronaviruses. And so there's tons of coronaviruses. Whether or not all of those could infect humans is a different story. It seems that the ones that can infect humans are coming from bats. And there are some, based on work that's very important and reliable work coming from China, as well as other places in the United States and other parts of the world, where they're going there, sampling, finding those sequences and identifying which bat coronaviruses look like they could make the jump. And those are ones that, of course, if you had a system in place to monitor, you could monitor for those and say, okay, we have a spillover event from the bat to a human, we need to be careful and begin the process of monitoring for this in the population.
So, Dr. Donaldson, obviously a premise of this entire summit is there's some momentum right now between around people's interest in, willingness to invest in, and even attempts to understand life sciences, biosciences, biotechnology in ways that they weren't interested probably 7 months ago, right? And I think for many of us who are lay people, we keep thinking, wow, this is a once in a century pandemic. This is something that is akin to the 1918 flu pandemic, and it's really infrequent, but really severe. And so we have to sort of rally around this. Yesterday, as we were talking about ways to capitalize on the momentum and really bring talent into Montana and invest in new talent developed here through educational facilities, I think Dr. Wiedenheft made a great question, or posed a great question, which is, this is all great, but is this a flash in a pan, or is this a long-term trend? Are we going to see continued investment, continued interest? And I guess I wonder, from your perspective, is this a once-in-a-century event, or is this something we walk away from, or do you think this is something that's going to increase in frequency as we move forward?
Yeah, so of course it's impossible to predict for sure. And if I were to guess, I would say that probably for the next 25 years, there's going to be a lot of interest in making sure that the infrastructure and the systems are in place to monitor for such a pandemic, and then probably it will decline until something happens. Now, whether or not there will be another pandemic of this nature within that time frame, I think is anybody's guess, but I think there is the potential for that to happen. I think we've seen with this one, and the difference between this one and MERS and SARS is the transmissibility. This virus is super good at transmitting. And so that seems to be one of the differences, and that's probably why MERS, I think, in the United States probably does not strike anybody as something to be too worried about because of its isolation to the Middle East, and also because it's just, it's got a high lethality, mortality rate in the 30% range, but it's just not that widespread. It doesn't seem to transmit well. SARS did not transmit particularly well because by the time you were transmissible, you were in the hospital. This one, you're transmitting a couple of days before symptoms probably, and for a few days after, several days after in some cases. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we can't predict. What we can predict and what we can monitor, I think, is, and this requires, a global partnership. And I think the global partnership is the important piece of this, because you want to be able to have good relations with the scientists in different countries when monitoring is happening, so that the information is transparent and there's a two-way street of flow, two-way flow of information from the U.S. and from China and from other parts of the world that are doing the monitoring. But I think, there have been some systematic failures. I think that there's, I heard somebody talking about, it's important to plant the tree. It would be better if you planted it 20 years ago. But the second best time would be to plant it now. And so maybe that's one of the lessons that we'll learn, is that we'll be planting the tree now. But I would argue that we've actually planted the tree at various times, but we've with different changes in philosophy and political environments, it seems like the nourishment of the planting seems to drop by the wayside. And so I think that, if anything comes out of this, I hope that there will be a nationwide sort of interest in monitoring and providing a better response to such events in the future. And that doesn't really directly answer your question about the next 1 to 3 years. I think, we saw SARS emerge in 2003, MERS about 9 years later in 2012, and then SARS-2 about 7 to 8 years later. So if you're looking at that, then 5 to 6 years from now, we might expect to see another coronavirus spillover, and who knows what that might look like. But in the backdrop of what's happened since the turn of the the new millennia, we've seen Zika, we've seen enterovirus, we've seen a variety of different pathogens. So influenza pandemic of 2009. So yes, we're going to have more pandemics. We're probably going to have more coronavirus pandemics. We'll probably have more influenza pandemics. And so I think it's important that we get the infrastructure and the systems in place to be able to address those things, because they're not going to go away.
Thanks.
The second best time, being now to plant that tree.
Yeah.
in terms of, we're speaking to business community, policymakers, administrators, people that are, on the front line of the COVID epidemic, people that are on the front line of the business side of, dealing with the epidemic. You mentioned, the critical infrastructure. What does that look like? Where should investments be made withstand the next bumps or the duration of this bump?
Yeah, so I think that, one of the most disappointing things that I've experienced with this pandemic, and one that shocked me in a way, is the public response to science and the almost disdain in some places for public health recommendations. And so it seems like a fundamental place to start is science education and public health education in general. And I wonder if, some of this isn't related to the fact that we haven't seen a pandemic that had a major impact on the whole population in such a way in the last 100 years or so. So we've sort of lost sight of what it means to come together as a community and fight a pathological invader, if you will. As far as the other infrastructure, I think funding things like One Health, where there are actually researchers who are going out and looking for the different viruses and studying how they, how the virus interacts with different receptors from the bat to human and other species, so that you understand, first of all, you can understand how they're making the jump from the wild into the human population. And second, it gives you the target for designing therapeutics, and such as vaccines and drugs that could potentially block that interaction. And I think we have the opportunity. If we had invested in this, if we had planted the tree 20 years ago and watered it and nourished it, we'd have antivirals on the shelf that would be able to protect against this coronavirus. There are targets in the coronavirus that are conserved to the point where you should be able to develop an antiviral drug that would be broad acting across a variety of different coronaviruses that you could pull off the shelf in the case of an emergency and stop it, or at least have a viable solution right up front that could be used. But the bottom line is that those kinds of things are not considered fundable generally because there is no threat. When there's a threat, then the funding comes in. With SARS, a lot of funding came in to do research around SARS for a vaccine and antivirals, but then 5 to 7 years later, there's not much interest. Then MERS comes along, and there's a little bit of a bump, but it's not a U.S. problem so much, so the funding doesn't really focus on that. And so coronavirologists over the years have had to focus on a variety of different avenues to try to find funding. And so it makes it difficult when you don't have the continuity of funding to be able to address those kinds of things. But I think that if we really were serious and we planted that tree, that we could have those drugs available.
I have a follow-up on that, Dr. Donaldson, which is, so I'm trained in geology and geophysics and spent time, my research was focused on seismic risk characterization and a little bit of work on flood frequencies. And this idea of being prepared for big hazards is one that always vexes geosciences in terms of earthquakes, right? We have so much knowledge about how to be prepared for them, and yet nobody prepares for them until after one has happened. And I found over the last couple of days, listening to Marshall Bloom, the director of Rocky Mountain Labs, also Dr. Koo in Billings, this frustration of, we've got a lot of scientific knowledge here. What we can't get people to do is listen to the communication around what the science means and what they need to do. If we could get people to pay more attention. And as somebody who's writing books and clearly likes to both communicate well and do science, where is our failure there in terms of our capacity to focus on how to communicate science effectively, to really get people's attention and encourage them to take action where it can be so helpful?
Yeah, that's a really good question, something that I've thought a lot about, because I feel like the fundamental problem is that you're dealing with a very complex topic, and a lot of scientists spend a lot of time thinking about a very narrow, viewpoint of the problem. And so communicating that, first of all, it's hard to even get to the point where you can communicate about what you do without going through a whole bunch of complex steps in the beginning. And so it seems to me that, and I don't really have an answer for what the best thing to do, but it seems to me that the best way forward would be to participate, have graduate programs that have a component of public education, speaking science to the layperson. One of the things that I did when I was at UNC was they had a thing called DNA Day, where you went to a high school and as a graduate student that specializes in genetics or something, and you just shared your experience about working, and when you're working with the coronavirus, evolution, you get a lot of genetic changes. So it became a very fascinating exchange between myself and the students as we went back and forth talking about how in this case, a viral RNA is copied and how it makes proteins and how it goes through the process of evolution. And so I think those are the kinds of things that help. And the problem is that, typically those are conversations that are only happening with honors students. And so they're not happening with the general population. And the sense that I got from this whole thing is that, man, there's a lot of opportunity if we could find a way to do it. And I'm not sure that I'm good at doing it. It's something that I work at getting better at, but it's not something I feel confident that I do well.
Thanks.
So every student in the basic sciences should take a public speaking and social media class.
Yeah.
Well, have a dual impact, right? I mean, Liz, Mark, you talked about you can't be what you can't see, and I think expose people to potential career paths and opportunities, but also just to create some fundamental science literacy and understanding would probably be a great dual value out of a program of that type. Thank you.
Yeah, there's an interesting, I'm not sure about the time, I better check, but there's there's a chat with a virologist, which is an opportunity available at the American Society for Virology if you go to the website and sign up. And then you can have a virologist come to your coffee date, to your classroom, to your meeting, just to chat, to discuss various impacts of coronavirus. So I think that's one way that this information can get communicated. I know of a couple of science podcasts that do a pretty good job of communicating. But, then again, it takes a commitment on the part of the listener to start and see it through. It's so easy. And I'm learning too, at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody that I knew was calling me. They wanted to know as much about the virus and about what was going to happen and all of that. And now as we're further along into the pandemic and there's some uncertainty and people are wanting to go out and they want to gather a little bit, they're not calling. I think they don't want to know what I would tell them at this point. That's my impression, particularly with my family. Talking about gathering for big events for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so, we have a strange relationship with information. But I think if it's a part of, the curriculum in high school, talking about part of a high school science class, talking about epidemiology, pandemic preparedness sort of thing, would be an interesting one-day class where they at least have some idea of what it means to physical distance so that you're protecting the community from getting an outbreak, rather than just protecting yourself. Just the little subtle nuances of what it means to actually do the public health practices, I think, would be important.
Clearly, one of the themes, Grant, across all of these conversations has been communication, connectivity, taking what we've learned through the pandemic in terms of telemedicine, telework, and keeping that trajectory in place past the pandemic. I mean, Dr. Bodnar, our pediatrician, in the last session said that it's a competitive advantage to maintain connection. And I think that we all knew that, but how we had connection, we all defined differently. And today it's shifting. It sounds like the role of a scientist is shifting as well as public opinion and therefore policy and funding shifts. And which is the question I have for you, is that there has been a movement in the science community looking at particularly what you do, but the basic sciences as a national security issue, and that being funded at the level of 1% compared to the Department of Defense is inadequate going forward. And so say we saw that change to 10%. And so 10x fold in investment in the work that you do and population health, social determinants, virology, basic sciences. Where would be the best place to make that investment, you think?
I think it makes sense to make the investment across a number of different sectors. So you want to fund some of the basic research so that you have the understanding. One of the biggest questions I think that we have with SARS-CoV-2 is how is it interacting with the immune system to cause the inflammatory element that occurs somewhere after the infection seems to be coming down. We don't really understand that at all, and yet that's a huge part that's driving the acute respiratory distress syndrome and the pneumonia and the severe disease and the death. And so we need to understand those things and so that we can treat them better. I think that having the resources available to respond, PPE, the simple things such as PPE, I think it's a systematic failure that when the pandemic is, we knew that it was coming maybe in February, that there was there was still a lack of PPE, ventilators, syringes, the sampling, the swab. All of those things. So having a stockpile of those sorts of things available. I think that I've heard throughout the conference that I've attended, the sessions I've attended, the shortage of personnel trained to respond to a public health emergency, the lack of trained professionals to work in the diagnostic labs. So all of those are places where some money could be spent to help bolster our response. I think one of the fundamental things that, from my opinion, that impacts the pandemic maybe more than anything else is just that this concept, an American concept and certainly a Montana concept, that we don't stay home when we're sick because we're strong and we're going to go to work, and especially if we're not getting paid to stay home when we're sick. And just the idea of having sick leave available to people that are sick so they don't feel the need to go to work, and having health care available when they're sick enough that they should be seeing a doctor. All of those things, I think, are investments that would help impact the severity of an outbreak and a pandemic for sure. And along with the One Health sort of thing that I was talking about before, monitoring, I think there would be money available. Money should be available to the scientists who are on the front lines in the wild doing the sampling to try to identify which pathogens, and using that information to develop drugs and vaccines potentially against some of those that look like they could be candidates. And I think, like I've said, that some of those drug targets are conserved. The coronavirus, has some proteins that are highly conserved across the different families, or the different branches of the coronavirus tree. And so you could come up with an antiviral that would be something you could go to if something like this happened again. And of course, I'm very coronavirus focused because I think they're the coolest virus. They're the largest RNA virus on the planet that we know of. But that's just one virus. We also know that flu. There's Zika virus. All of the different viruses that I mentioned earlier are out there too. So there, money could be spent across the spectrum in a variety of different pathogens, such as the antibiotic resistant bacteria that are emerging again.
One thing I was really hoping to hear from you about, Dr. Donaldson, is we heard in our first day some notion that there was a lot of gratitude or appreciation for the fact that the FDA was able to find some ways to change the regulatory process to expedite some of the approval process for various testing or methodologies or things needed in this crisis. You're kind of on the front lines of approval of things at the FDA. Is it your sense that there is opportunity, or we found ways to lower our regulatory framework or expedite approval processes and still maintain confidence that we're delivering safe products for people to use?
Yeah, so let me just start off by saying I'm not speaking on behalf of FDA when I say this, but the bottom line is that the career scientist at FDA is working under the regulations and policies of the federal government. And so those standards cannot change and will not change. And as a reviewer that's looking at the data on whether or not something is safe and effective, my decision is always, what I'm thinking about in my head is this something that I would feel safe giving to my grandmother or my mother, who's already severely sick and this drug may or may not work? Is there enough of a risk-benefit ratio in the favor of benefit that I would let that go forward? And I think that there's a lot of hubble going on at the upper levels, but I think when you get to the level of the career scientist who's doing the review work on a day-to-day basis, that from what I've seen is that there's been nothing but all hands on deck. We're going to work as hard as we can. We're going to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted so that these are safe and effective, but we want to get them out as quickly as possible because we're in the middle of an emergency situation and we want to save lives.
Great.
I want to point out that Eric has 2 books out there, Seventh Extinction, The Genesis Project, and The Virus Chronicles, The Culling. Fascinating, apocalyptic reads based in science. And I can't wait to see Eric's 3rd book, COVID 2025.
It'll be a short story because I had no idea that the response would be the way that it was. So I think that mayhem will happen a lot sooner than I ever predicted in the first 2 books.
Well, I wish that weren't the case. The apocalyptic.
We've learned through this process to be able to move forward, yeah.
Listen, I want to thank you both so much for your time and expertise and your passion for helping us out in Montana. Dr. Donaldson, I hope you find your way back here soon.
I hope so.
Maryland is no substitute.
No, certainly.
And Sean, thank you so much for being a great host today. We really appreciate all of your effort to get this summit up and running and all of your help in organizing, but also in just being a part of the day and bringing together a great group of people. So thank you both so much. I just want to take a second to thank our sponsors who really were extraordinary at stepping up for a first-time event and supporting this and getting behind it. Thanks so much to the Montana Bioscience Cluster Initiative, C2M Beta, powered by Blackfoot, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, 2 Bear Capital, and of course the Montana Bioscience Alliance. I think if there's anything to take away from these last 3 days, it is clear that our strengths are our people. We just have incredible talent and passion across the state. I think we're developing new tools to overcome the challenges that we face in terms of our great distances between us. And I think we've seen some really valuable lessons come out of COVID that have allowed people to understand how they can adapt, how they can collaborate, and what they can do to move forward and be more agile in the future. And certainly we are reaping the benefits of generations of great life sciences and biosciences in Montana, but we have a cohort and a collection of outstanding scientists here now and a very bright future. So we'll look forward to taking some of these lessons, continuing to do outreach with policymakers and a community of economic developers and continue to make the case that this is just a really important industry to continue to support, to cultivate, and to invest in. And we're excited to be a partner in that process, to continue to work with some of our sponsors who are also partners in that process too. And we look forward to continue to work with many of you on a healthier and more sustainable and resilient Montana for health and economic reasons going forward. So appreciate everybody's time and effort to be here and be a part of this. We appreciate you as an audience for overcoming your Zoom fatigue and then being a part of this for 3 days. And thank you so much for what we think has been a very successful first Big Sky Business Insight Summit. Take care and be safe.